first thing I have to ask you is how and where did you find wrestling, and in what way do you think it's impacted your life?
How I found it, it was found for me. I'm the fifth of six kids. My oldest brother is probably 10 or 11 years older than I am. So when he was in high school, um, you know, uh, 10th grade, 11th grade, I was probably in first or second grade. And when he wrestled, our high school in New Jersey was one of the best teams in the state. And in the early 70s, um, you only had three channels. So they had a great following. They would have a packed house every match. And I can just remember riding in the back of my parents' station wagon, just going all over the state of New Jersey to his matches. And as a first, second, third grader, whatever I was, it kind of had an impact on me. And so I started wrestling then, and it's I've been with it ever since. How it's affected every aspect of my life. It affected where I went to college. It affected where I wanted to go to law school because I wanted to stay close to the UTC program. And obviously, it's affected what I've done. I've officiated for the last 25 years, so it's really been with me since age 5 or 6.
Well, that is interesting to know that you had a family connection to the sport, and also you mentioned how it's stuck with you through, of course, college and then post college. And one thing I think that's so interesting about wrestling is that unlike a lot of other sports, it never really leaves your life. There's so many, I feel like, aspects to it that pop back up every once in a while, or just there's always a connection to the sport in some way, I feel like, even after you step off the mat.
Yeah, I mean when you're new to a town, and if you played basketball or football and you're at a restaurant or a bar and you meet somebody, you don't necessarily say, "Oh, I'm an old high school basketball player," but
Mhm.
I don't know, maybe it's the ears that helps people identify themselves. But when you find out somebody is an old wrestler, you have an instant connection to them. I think it's because, quite honestly, it's the toughest sport, and
Oh yeah.
so I think there's mutual respect. If I go to a town and I run into somebody and he tells me he wrestled definitely in college and even in high school, I know that guy is a tough dude, and he's dedicated, and you know everybody goes to practice, but the cut and the weight and all the
Mhm.
other things that wrestlers have to do, I think kind of gives us all a mutual bond of respect.
Right. No, I mean, I agree 100% because it definitely is one of those sports, like you mentioned, where when you meet a fellow wrestler, there's there's just that different type of respect there, and I think it's because it's such a hands-on sport that requires you to, encounter so much adversity, especially at a young age, to where it really shapes how you are as a person.
I agree. I always said it. If you can make it through wrestling, there's you can use that mental toughness that you got, and you can get through whatever it is. You can get through an academic class that you think is difficult, or a challenge that's ahead of you or that you're facing. Hey, I was able to make it through wrestling and able to cut weight and do all those things. I can get through this challenge also.
Right. Now, kind of shifting gears a little bit. So, after you finished out your high school career, you were recruited to wrestle for the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. How did you hear about UTC, and what made it to where you wanted to pick that place to continue your academic and athletic career?
Well, again, my oldest brother wrestled at the University of Virginia, and I wanted to go south. Um, and when I was in high school, um, I would have loved to have wrestled at Virginia. They weren't interested in me, unfortunately. But I was looking at a couple of different schools, Old Dominion in Norfolk, Virginia, and a couple of other schools. My senior year, I was doing well and getting recruited. The truth of the matter is, and UTC was looking at me. I probably didn't do as well in the postseason as maybe some of the schools that were recruiting me thought I was going to do, and they kind of backed off on me and lost interest. And Chattanooga was one of the few schools that stayed with me, so I appreciated their loyalty, and that's what led me to come down here.
Well, I think also to be, in my perspective, to be picked up by them because you look at the historical significance of it. I mentioned this when I did the write up for the episode preview. You were the only true freshman on a legendary squadron for them because you had Charlie Hurd, John Feldhacker, and many others. And this was a team, just coming off of their best performance in the D1 national tournament.
Right.
So I think to come in as a true freshman and especially do well that first year out is extremely impressive.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, my high school career didn't end as I had hoped it would, and I think that helped me. I didn't accomplish my goals in high school, and I was, I played two sports in high school, and really you could argue I played three. All my best friends were basketball players, so all summer long, I played basketball with them. Same season as wrestling. So I didn't play in high school, but I I realized I was going to a legit program, and if I was going to be serious about this, I really needed to dedicate myself. And so after I graduated high school that summer, I worked harder than I had ever worked before, and made tremendous strides. And then just coming into a room with so many accomplished wrestlers, my freshman year, um, for whatever reason, I had a couple upperclassmen that just took a liking to me and worked with me a lot. So from my last match my senior year in high school to my first match my freshman year in college, I just made tremendous strides and got a ton better.
Right. Now, so after making the move down south to UTC, what was it like adapting to that kind of different environment and the college room as well?
Well, I was a mama's boy. So as I said, I'm the fifth of six kids. Um, and when I, decided to go to Chattanooga, um, I can't tell you how many of my friends in high school, placed bets on how long I'd last down there. And the bets were anywhere from one day, probably the longest anybody thought I'd make it would probably have been a couple of months. Um, and my parents dropped me off and waved goodbye. And, that was probably the middle of August. And, the Southern Scuffle is a tournament now that we host over January 1 and 2. When I was in college, the big tournament we hosted was the Southern Open, which was over Thanksgiving. And so when I got here in the middle of August and realized that the Southern Open was over Thanksgiving, I realized I wasn't going to be able to go home until Christmas time. So that was a big adjustment for me, and was tough. The best thing that happened to me was, as you said earlier, that I started as a freshman, and so the upperclassmen took me in, and I went on road trips. I was the only freshman to go on the road trips, so it really helped me forget about being homesick, because I had so much going on with wrestling and with schooling. So it was a big adjustment. From a wrestling standpoint, it was a big adjustment. Again, it was the first time I had dedicated myself to just wrestling, to just the one sport. When I was playing football, football was my favorite sport. When I was in wrestling, wrestling was my favorite sport. But until I till my high school ended, I really hadn't dedicated myself just to one particular sport.
Right. Well, I mean, I think also, kind of like you mentioned earlier, being that true freshman, I feel like that'd be a huge confidence booster, especially starting out your college career like that, because I mean, like I mentioned earlier, just a legendary lineup, and to be able to be taken under some upperclassmen's wing and be able to work with them, iron sharpens iron. So obviously, I think it probably seemed like it went off to the best start that it could.
Yeah, I mean, that Southern Open that we had, um, it was a beast of a tournament, and I beat a couple really good kids. I remember we were on the van a week or two after the Southern Open, going to wrestle somewhere, and Amateur Wrestling News. Of course, there was no internet; you didn't know the rankings, but Amateur Wrestling News came out, and they had the top 20 rankings. And I looked down at my weight class, which I started at 177, my first semester of my freshman year, and I looked down at the number. I think he was ranked ninth or 10th or 11th, somewhere in that vicinity. Was a guy named Tim Cooper from Tennessee,
Mhm.
who I had beaten 2 weeks earlier in the Southern Open, and that was kind of a huge confidence boost to see that I could hang with guys that were ranked in the country. So that
Right.
that helped me. I was in a room with Charlie Hurd, who had finished second in the nation the year before, was ranked number one all year. That my freshman year, I saw what he did. He was the lightest weight class, so I didn't wrestle with him, but I just was around people that were good and successful. Billy Moss, my freshman year, Charlie was ranked number one in the country the entire year. Guy
Right.
named Billy Moss, who in high school was the outstanding wrestler in the what they now call the Fargo, national tournament. It wasn't Fargo back then, but he won it and was outstanding wrestler. Went on a full scholarship to Iowa State and had transferred to UTC. He was ranked in the vicinity of 8 to 12. Feldhacker, you mentioned, was probably ranked in the vicinity of 12 to 18, somewhere there. And we had a couple of other guys that were on the cusp of the rankings. So I was around guys that had success and that were awesome wrestlers.
Oh yeah, no, and I forgot to mention Billy Moss earlier, but I knew that one name was slipping my mind in that group. But with that legendary lineup also comes a legendary coach. And in your coaching career, before Ethan Reed stepped in, you were coached under Jim Morgan. And what was Jim Morgan like as a coach?
He and Coach Reed were so different, but they were both fantastic coaches. Coach Morgan, had a very, upperclassman team, as you said, other than myself. So, and had some just great talent on that team. His attitude was, you guys know what it takes to be good. If you want to be good, you'll do what's right. And he gave his student athletes a little bit more flexibility, which helped me tremendously because, again, guys like Billy Moss, for whatever reason, took a liking to me. And Billy showed me so many things my true freshman year that I ended up using and getting pretty decent at. And we didn't have a terribly regimented practice where everybody was doing the same thing. So I learned a ton because Billy Moss showed me a lot on his feet. John Feldhacker was a great mat wrestler and showed me a lot of, tilts and turns and legs, because we had the flexibility and we had a little bit more of a, free practice.
Mm-hmm.
And then he left after my first year, and Ethan Reeve came in, and Coach Reeve was much more regimented. But luckily for me, I now had a strong base and had a good, technique base, and Coach Reeve just made us tougher and meaner, and we were in great shape. We knew that Iowa was more talented than we were,
Mm-hmm.
but we really believed that nobody was working harder than us
Right.
in the country. So it was a great experience having Coach Morgan. It helped me out tremendously, but it was also a great experience, and it was great timing personally for me when Coach Reeve came in and just helped me get also a lot tougher.
Right. So, and you mentioned Morgan allowing a little bit more kind of free range in practice, which it's interesting that you mentioned that because one thing I picked up on is that in college, especially for wrestling, you have to figure out what works for you, and that goes for warm ups and practice in general. To where if you have to drill your best takedowns, drilling you see a lot of progress more so than I think than live, and you have to know what works for you in that regard. So I think him allowing that kind of free range, like you said, really opened the window to explore new techniques and figure out what works and what doesn't. And then with Coach Reeves stepping in, it seemed like he kind of took that and then really just superset that and built on top of it.
Yeah, no question. I mean, again, it worked for the team that we had. It worked for Coach Morgan because we had Charlie Hurd. Charlie was so unique. He was the fastest wrestler I've ever seen in my life. You couldn't take Charlie and put him in a regimented practice. I mean, he needed a little bit of free reign. He needed to be able to you couldn't teach Charlie something. I mean, Charlie had just natural ability. I mean, he was a South Georgia kid. But so I don't know that, that he would ever be able to teach, what he did to others. He was the most athletic person I've ever seen in my life.
Right.
He was the fastest person I ever seen in my life. But also, I can remember, sitting before practice, just kind of sitting on the mat, waiting for everybody to show up. And somebody would come up behind me and put me kind of in a chokehold, just fooling around. And the first time it happened, I said, "Who is this guy that has these arms? This has to be a 190 pounder or a heavyweight because he was so strong." And then when I finally was able to turn my head, it was our little 118 pounder. So Charlie had the most amazing combination of speed and strength. You just couldn't teach that. So he was great, and he was great for Coach Morgan, and Coach Morgan was great for him. But the next year, I went from being the youngest guy on the team to 2 years later being the oldest guy on the team.
Right.
And so with Coach Reeve, we had all freshmen and sophomores starting for 2 or 3 years, and so we needed a lot more regimented, practice where every minute Coach Reeve had laid out from 3 o'clock to 3:05. We'd have a little meeting. He'd go over what we were going to do and I don't remember this exactly, but from 3:05 to 3:20, we did stretches, and we did the exact same stretches every day for 4 years.
Right.
And then we did drills, and we did this, and everything was regimented. And it, again, because we had a young team, it was what we needed. So it worked out perfectly.
Right. Well, I think also, like you mentioned, Charlie Hurd's style, and I've watched back his finals match from the 1983 NCAA championships, and his style, like even his stance, in my opinion, was just so unique that you could really tell that it was a combination of things, and he had the athletic abilities to make it work in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have a ton of videotape back then, but he would just kind of sit back like this, and if you just reached for his head, he was ducking underneath you, and you may not even see it. He was that quick. He would just, I mean, I think I'm right about this. Go back and look at scores from back then. I believe my freshman year, we didn't have a 15-point technical
Hmm.
superiority in place. Charlie would beat people, good people. He would beat them 25-6 and 31-7. And he just scored points at a rate that will never be duplicated again.
Yeah, I mean, tremendous athlete from the stories I've heard and just from watching the little tape that is still out there and that's still
Right.
available. Um, Now, kind of going on the next question here, because you mentioned how the four over the course of the 4 years, the rest of your college career. So you finished your college career as a three-time SoCon champion, 190 pounds, three-time NCAA qualifier. You had a very impressive career record. So undoubtedly, you exit UTC as one of the best wrestlers to come out of the program. What are some of your takeaways from your college career?
The relationships, um, you know, I came down here my senior in high school. I flew down to Chattanooga over spring break, and I stayed. The guy that I stayed with, who was my recruiting coordinator or whatever you want to call it, was a guy named Chuck Bean, and Chuck was one of my best friends. Sadly, he's passed away, um, but I came back the next year, and Chuck was so giving, um, such a great guy. John Feldhacker, still to this day, I don't do a great job. I should do a better job of keeping in contact with him. But when we see each other, it's like you can take away the last 30 years. It's just our friendship. And then, the guys that came in after me, whether it's Mark Allison or Dan Matlack, who was my roommate, just the guys on the team. We had 30 guys on the team. The one thing, and it's hard to do, but Coach Reeve came in, was a little bit of a dictator when he first came in. Again, Coach Morgan said, "You guys know what you need to do," and kind of gave us a little bit of flexibility. Coach Reeve came in and said, "You have to live on campus."
Mm-hmm.
So we had 30 wrestlers, all of whom lived in what we called the village back then.
Mm-hmm.
We all lived within 100 yards of each other, and it didn't matter. I may have had my best friends, but any one of those 30 guys, they may knock on my door and be sitting on my couch, before practice one day, or I may be knocking on their door and sitting on their couch before.
Right.
We were a very close team. You lose a little bit of that when you live off campus. Three guys live in Red Bank. Two guys live over in East Ridge. You don't have that camaraderie.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's another thing about wrestling. I mean, you travel. At least we did. We traveled. 10 guys in a van, sometimes sleeping on each other, in just crazy positions because you're driving all the way up to Penn State, 12 hours away. And I think that builds, camaraderie among the team. And to this day, those guys are all just great friends of mine.
Well, I mean, I 100% agree about the team camaraderie because, you mentioned like traveling in the van and all that stuff. And I think it's just an example. Part of it is just going through the hard times with people that you're close to. And in wrestling, you could be best friends going into practice, go hard in practice, and you're going to leave practice with probably even greater respect for each other because you're pushing each other to your limits and working to get one another better. And I think in college, especially, it becomes a lot more apparent.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. I said this when I got inducted into UTC's Hall of Fame. You're only as good as your workout partners,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no coincidence that, the guy that wrestled 4 years underneath me at 177 was Charlie Buckshaw, 4-time conference champion. And the guy that wrestled above me at heavyweight was Chris Thornberry, who, but for the fact a horrible injury he had, was a 3-time conference champion, would have been a 4-time conference champion. We're all in the Hall of Fame. Well, that's because every day for 4 years I worked out with either or both Charlie Buckshaw and Chris Thornberry. And if for some reason I went down a weight below Charlie, it would have been Brett Gustafson, who was a 4-time conference champion and an All-American. So, when you've got workout partners like those guys, you're going to get better. I mean, just through osmosis, just through being around them and working hard with them. Hopefully, those guys would say, that Jeff Rufolo made me better.
Right. No, iron sharpens iron, like I mentioned earlier, and those are all guys that listed as UTC greats, Brett Gustafson and Charlie Buckshaw and all those people. Now, you mentioned the UTC Hall of Fame, which sets up another question. So in 2018, you were inducted in the UTC Hall of Fame. Overall, what does this honor mean to you?
To be honest, I think my wife, who I didn't know, I didn't meet until law school, and my daughter, who obviously wasn't around when I wrestled, I think they were maybe even a little bit happier about it than I was. I had a good career. I mean, again, just like high school, it didn't end exactly how I'd hoped. I would have liked to have won two or three more matches at the national tournament and been an All-American. I didn't make that. I was just ever so close. So I was happy with my career, and I'm proud of the fact that I got inducted into the Hall of Fame. But I mean, I can't say I wasn't happy when I got the call, but I didn't necessarily need it. I think my wife was happier, and I think my daughter was happier when I got in.
Right. Well, I mean, all around, like I mentioned earlier, you came out of UTC as one of the best. And if you look, I mean, even if you look down the record books, in my opinion, your name's in there multiple times, which that contributes back to hard work. And also you join a legendary class of wrestlers alone that are in that Hall of Fame. And, look at Jim Morgan, Charlie Hurd, and Feldhacker and all those guys. But so kind of making a little bit of a switch here. Obviously you've been reffing for, I believe, is it over 20 years now?
Yeah, I think 24 years.
So what made you want to get into reffing?
Well, Coach Reeve, I'll never forget this, when I was still wrestling for him, even as a wrestler, even as an athlete, he talked to us about giving back to the sport. And I took that to heart. And so when I, graduated college, I went to law school. As I said earlier, I wanted to come back to Chattanooga and practice law because, in part, I wanted to stay involved in UTC's program. I wanted to stay involved in wrestling. It did so much for me. And, in the back of my head, I could hear Coach Reeve saying, you got to give back to the sport. So, my first, second years back here, Tom Sell and I, another teammate of mine, we coached a little kid wrestling program, 2nd through 6th grade, something like that. I don't know that I have the patience for little 2nd graders. And so then maybe a year or two after that, a couple of my friends were now, coaching, head coaches at the high schools around Chattanooga and North Georgia. So, one day I'd go over to Northwest Whitfield, where Eric Phillips was the head coach, and help him out. And, Ben Reichel has been a head coach at either Red Bank or Silverdale, even CCS. So I would go over there and help him out. And, but I just didn't feel like I was really making a connection, that I was truly giving back to the sport. So I think it was 1997. I decided I wanted to, try refereeing. And I feel like it's a great way to stay involved in the sport. It's a fun way to keep in contact with my buddies who ended up coaching and teaching, who I don't see that often, but I see them during wrestling season. And then it's a fun way to get to know kids who are coming up, through the ranks and
Right.
getting whether, from you to, Kevin Ward. I mean, Kevin's the head coach at West Point, and I, refed his high school matches. And so it gave me, some connection when Kevin was wrestling at Oklahoma State, when Matt Keller, who went out first to Nebraska and then came back to Chattanooga and was a two-time All-American for us. I saw Keller when he was at Nebraska at the national tournament. And on a break, we just kind of passed, and he just pointed to me and said, "Hey, that's that Chattanooga official."
Right.
And so it's just been a cool way to stay involved in the sport and watch kids develop, whether they're go on to wrestle college or whether their career stops in high school. I've enjoyed, and I know hundreds of kids, and I see them downtown at lunch, or I see them at the sports barn, and they'll come up to me and they're like, "Did you referee?" I mean, I'm definitely known more as a high school referee than I am as a college wrestler. Anybody that knows me as a college wrestler is old, or they study a lot of history like yourself.
Oh, thank you.
But a lot of kids know me which I'm proud of, know me as a high school, official.
Well, you mentioned the memories and the connections, and that kind of sets up my next question. Out of all the dual meets, out of all the tournaments and everything you've repped, what is your favorite duel and your favorite match
Wow. As a wrestler or as an official?
as an official?
As an official. Um, I refereed the Soddy Daisy versus Bradley match probably in, I don't know, 2000, 2001. It was the number one team in the state versus the number two team in the state. Funny story, Rob Yehorchuk, who is better known because of his kids. I don't know if he had any kids at the time, but he called me up. Somehow we started talking, and he asked if he could ride up to Bradley County with me. So Rob and another guy drove up there with me, and it was just a great atmosphere. Like I said, it was the number one versus number two team in the state. I'd been a referee for 4 years, maybe 5 years, somewhere in that vicinity. It was probably one of the earliest, biggest matches that I did. And it was just a tight match in a packed gym, with a spotlight on the mat like Bradley does. So that's a dual meet that sticks out. There's just countless other state finals that I've done that were great matches. Fast forward, I mentioned earlier the guy that took me around on my recruiting trip was Chuck Bean. When the state tournament moved to Franklin, Tennessee, to the Cow Palace, we got this. I was doing the state finals, and we got assigned particular matches, and I got assigned to do a match of two Nashville kids. They don't want a Nashville ref probably doing that match, so I was doing that match. It ended up being a great match. It was voted the best match of the state tournament finals. It was Chuck Bean's nephew.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't realize that until after the match was over. But that was kind of a neat connection. The guy, probably the reason I'm down here, was because I had such a great time with Chuck on my recruiting trip. And then 25, 30 years later, whatever it was, I'm doing his nephew's state finals match, and it was a fabulous match. I don't even remember. I think he won. I don't even remember the outcome. I just know it was a great 1 point match with a ton of close calls, and it was just fun to see that go full circle.
Yeah, no, like you mentioned, it is very interesting how things can go full circle like that. Now one last question before we kind of wrap up here. We got a couple of minutes left. Do you think that for high school, do you think that it would be a benefit or a non-benefit to add in the 4 point near fall rule and college out of bounds?
Uh, I'll answer the second one first. I would love to see the college out of bounds rule. It it's easier. It's easier to officiate. It's easier to call. If something's in bounds, we're wrestling. Um, and I just wish they would go to that.
Hmm.
I actually don't like the college 4 point near fall rule. I think that, what we should have done, and I still am a proponent of this, especially in college, I wish takedowns were worth 3 points. Um, because especially when you look at high level college matches, it is so hard to get a takedown.
Hmm.
And I think you should be, and it's not that hard to get an escape. So sometimes you look at a match and a takedown is really only worth 1 point.
Right.
If I get two and you get one, the net is just a positive of one. I think you should reward what I think is the hardest thing to do in college wrestling, which is get a takedown.
Hmm.
So I think you should that should be worth 3 points. The problem, at least in my opinion, and it's not as bad in high school, but I think there's a problem in college wrestling with top stalling.
Hmm.
And watch the national tournament, and guys go to, rides and inside thigh chops, and they're really not working for pins. And the only turns you're seeing now are tilts. And and I just think it would have been better served to keep it 2 points or 3 point near fall and a 3 point takedown. Because what that would have done, even though you kept riding time,
Hmm.
you would reward guys for being aggressive on their feet and getting takedowns. Now, the ironic thing about all that is that would have killed me, because if you look at where I was decent, um, I was a better mat wrestler and I was better at terms. I wasn't great on my feet. So that's a rule that would not have helped me, but I think it would add excitement to college. Um, and I try to bounce that off of people all the time. Chuck Barbie, who's the rules official, who coached here as an assistant at UTC and then went on to West Point head coach. He's now got something to do with being in charge of officials and rules. I've said it to him, and I just think it would make college wrestling a lot more exciting.
Well, I agree 100%. And thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. It's a great opportunity to get to interview you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.